Virginia Moore, Communications Director at the Center for Financial Inclusion at Acción. Welcome to our podcast for Financial Inclusion Week 2019. We're excited to have our guests today, Till Bruit from DAI, Bobby Gray from Grameen Foundation, and Shivani Thoreau from TALA to discuss an important question and the theme of Financial Inclusion Week 2019, which is financial inclusion for what? Or in other words, what is financial inclusion for? What's the ultimate goal? What does financial inclusion ultimately help us to achieve?
I'm Till Bruit. I'm the Global Practice Lead for Financial Services and Investment at Development Alternatives. And until recently, I was leading the digital finance work at UN Capital Development Fund. At UNCDF, when I was leading the digital finance work, we had a series of global conferences with our partners from around the world, from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The first one was on DFS Goes Rural, DFS for digital finance, because we realized that we were hitting a wall and we were unable to reach rural clients with digital finance, or if we were reaching them in a very passive way. So we were challenging the participants to really see how to go rural, which included dragging 120 people out to rural Uganda to go through a series of testing and conversations with clients in the field, some human-centric design exercises. And then a couple of years later, we recognized that the gender gap wasn't closing because of digital finance, even though we were expanding the number of people who did have access. And so we did a similar exercise called DFS for Women, where instead they went out and did data collection in real time so that they could come back and look at the data and look at how men and women used digital finance differently, but also how their attitudes differed and how their preferences differed. But why this was timely for us is last year, half jokingly, I suggested that our global conference should be DFS for what? And everyone sort of laughed for a while, but then we started talking about it, and we agreed that actually that was the question that we needed to answer. And we needed to answer it not because we were trying to make the for what possible. So it wasn't that we were focusing so much on energy or other uses. It's that, again, we were hitting a wall. And we realized that if we couldn't make digital finance useful in people's daily lives, enable them to actually do something they wanted to do, get something that they wanted to get, that we weren't going to be getting the remaining 60 to 70% of the population actively using it. And so we did. We had a conference with about 200 people on DFS for what, and explored all of the different ways that digital finance was being used in other areas of development in the economy, and how that was becoming a driver for financial inclusion. So I think one of the reasons we're asking this question is that if we want to achieve our financial inclusion goal of everyone being financially included, I think we have to answer the question, well, for what? And I think Bobby and I were talking, but I think it's a very real question, because sometimes there's very rational reasons that people remain financially excluded. So we have to address the challenge for what.
This is Bobby Gray, and I'm Research Director at Grameen Foundation. I'll just add, with Grameen Foundation having been in the financial services space for a really long time, with, Muhammad Yunus starting the work with Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, a lot of this work started out with a development objective of, working with women, making sure that they had access to financial services to build income, build empowerment, et cetera. But I think, at a certain point, you realize that there needs to be that financial objective in there to ensure that these do not stay as these remote development projects, but that it's an actual, providing people access to financial services. But I think, it's almost like this cyclical experience where you see the value of the financial services because you realize that you're also building an ecosystem where there are those use cases where different financial services create real value for people. I mean, within Grameen Foundation, we've spent a lot of time working with the health sector and the agricultural sector in, providing these development-oriented services, but you always come back to the fact that there are actual specific needs to respond to specific, or there are specific use cases for financial services within those needs. So for example, within the health sector, you need something that allows people to pay for health services, and there's not a lot going on right now in that space. And you hear all of the time, even within the agricultural space, just the need for agricultural financing and understanding what are the needs within ag. And it's not just credit for agriculture, but there are different types of agricultural needs where credit is needed, or where insurance is needed. So I think, I think at the exact same time, you can come at it from both directions, both recognizing they need to be available in the market, but they need to have very specific needs that they serve.
And Shivani Thoreau, the CEO of Tala.
Shivani, why does this question, what is financial inclusion for, resonate with you in your work?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what's been said. I mean, I think of, when I think of financial inclusion, I think I'm similar to the rest of the panel in that I think we think a lot about financial health. And in that respect, we're thinking about it as, exactly like that same concept of what are the jobs to be done and so we think of it as, what does someone want to use money for? How do they want to grow that money? How do they want to protect the money? And so there's these like very, I would almost say like physical needs around that money. And then I think what we also really think when we sometimes think about digital financial services and financial inclusion, sometimes I think we can overlook the emotional aspect as well about money. And so how can we also, while we're tracking, is this person able to now achieve all of the things they want with their money? Are they also, really emotionally more comfortable as well? And so how do we make sure that we track that aspect of financial inclusion as well?
That's interesting. That's a new sort of track, people's comfort or emotional health around their money and how they feel like they can change their lives with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's about that overall sense of security that people have, and how are we providing financial services that provide them with that greater sense of security. And it's only one aspect of personal security, but personal security is such a huge issue for all human beings, and I think financial is a key part of it. So yeah, I think that's something to consider.
Thanks, Till. Till, when you guys did your DFS conference, do you remember what you concluded with? DFS for what? What was it? What's the what?
Yeah, I think what we concluded is that there are a lot of different goals and immediate needs that people have, and the question is, do you go down a path where you specialize things? So you have, for instance, financial services embedded in these different types of services that enables them to get that specific thing that they want? Or do you try to create more broad-based platforms that can be used in many, many different ways, and that different companies or organizations can tap into and make useful? So I think we talked a lot about, the different approaches. So, one thing we saw in Senegal was that solar was starting to take off, and that was starting to drive usage. We also saw some very personal use cases about connecting with family members and finding ways for parents to support their students or their children that were going into Dakar. And so I don't think that we had one single answer, but I think what we heard overwhelmingly from people was that if they were able to find a way to make it useful, they would use it. But if it wasn't particularly useful, then they were just going to go back to cash and do the things that they needed to do anyway. And I think one thing also worth noting is that it wasn't easy in the discussions to get people to say, oh yeah, I really would like to use digital finance for this. Because if it doesn't exist, it's hard to picture what that would look like. It's hard for people to say, oh wow, actually, I could use digital finance for this if someone would just create this product or do that. So it's really not even about going out and saying people, well, how do you want to pay for this with digital finance? It's going through and understanding their needs and then figuring out, all right, is there an opportunity here to provide a better customer experience, to make it more secure, to make it more cost effective? And then ultimately, whatever that service is, whether it be clean energy or water or education, is it going to solve a problem that the sector has? that also makes it of value for the sector as a whole to be investing in that.
Yeah, until I might just add, I mean, something that you said about, should we design specific services for all of the individual needs? I mean, I think that's also something that that we've been thinking about when we've looked at health financing, for example, because we recognize that people need money when they go to the doctor, and sometimes they can anticipate health needs, but most of the time they experience health needs as a shock, even if they can anticipate a pregnancy. If they don't have the money available at the time, it's time to give birth, then it's going to be perceived, as an emergency. And one of the questions that we've raised is it better to give people access to, for example, emergency credit than it is to create a bunch of different specific emergency products, like an emergency agricultural loan versus an emergency health loan that you designate for very specific needs. And so I think, that's also part of the question. I mean, I feel like we've all accepted that this portfolio approach is very critical because people have various financial needs, and you need to be able to kind of cover all of those bases somehow or another. But then I'm not so sure that everything has to be so specialized to where all the products on the shelf, there's 30 versus 3 really good ones, or 4 really good ones that you just market differently so that people are reminded, oh, you can use this when you have crop failure, but you can also use this when you need to pay for hospital bills.
I'm curious what the group thinks in terms of, with all of us working in digital financial inclusion, instead of starting from the traditional structures of should we provide credit, should we think of insurance products, or investment products, these kinds of things, but rather thinking about what does the customer actually want to do with their money and the jobs to be done around that, and what those mental models are. And then in some ways, to your point, Bobby, the fluidity between what these different products are actually starts to happen a little bit more, versus an NGO or a company actually saying, we're the best at savings.
I mean, I think it's a really compelling question, because I'm even thinking of, what we know about traditional, microfinance, for example, the years of providing microcredit to groups of women, and all of the education that happened for such a long time around you should only use this credit for your business, and sometimes some organizations being pretty prescriptive and pretty, their monitoring systems are set up to make sure that they're not spending that money because they want to ensure, number one, there's a way to repay, and there's also, they want to see that theory of change play itself out where, there's business growth, and then there's further investment, et cetera. But I remember being in a conference once, and I actually think it was somebody from Innovations from Poverty Action who said, well, what if the best use of that credit for that household to ensure that they have income growth is that they're able to take the income earner to the hospital, for example, to get medical care, and at that moment investment in the business was not the most productive use of that credit at that moment. So I think it's a really compelling question, because I think if we all sit back and reflect that, many of us use our own credit cards for many different things. And some people may even start a little business activity by using their credit card to buy into Avon or Rodan and Fields or whatever it may be. They can technically start a business with that credit card, or I can take my child and pay for a copay if I don't have cash on hand. I mean, I think it's a great question. And I do wonder how you can move the needle on that to where you do have these traditional players who can transition from the beliefs that we've all held for a long time to providing that level of flexibility.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I mean, I started 2 different businesses over my career, and both times they were funded through credit cards, and that's how I didn't go and try to get a business loan. The paperwork would have been overwhelming. And even as a startup business in the United States, it's almost impossible to do. So, I mean, we've known forever doing microfinance, your business and your household expenses tend to blend together. I think people think of how they use their money in different buckets, but you will put your hand in one bucket and move it to another one when you need to do so. And you want to have that flexibility. So to get, Shivani, to your question, I agree. I think we still have a hard time because we use the term finance in our vocabulary and we think of ourselves as trying to, bank the poor. we do still think very much in terms of financial products rather than thinking in terms of what's possible. And I think that's where technology has been really interesting, because if you think about the technology around a digital wallet, in many ways, it kind of provides everything you, if we structured it correctly, the technology would allow for everything you need to do in terms of your financial life. You can put money away in small amounts. You can get it in small amounts. You could get it in large amounts. You can transfer it to people. People can transfer it to you. It's in many ways a perfect receptacle to do a whole bunch of different things, enabling you to do personal financial management, but at the same time, using that same tool to connect you to the outside world. But even with digital finance, I feel like we've built it around old banking constructs, which has limited the technology's usefulness, because we immediately put things in buckets. You know, this is digital credit, this is a payment, this is savings. But actually, it's just a technology that allows you to basically manage money in a bunch of different buckets if you choose to do so. So I do think that we are beginning to see people changing their idea of what finance and financial inclusion is. We all walk around with half a dozen apps on our phone, all of which in one way or another, whether we realize it or not, are a financial tool that we're using, but we're not necessarily thinking of them holistically as, oh, this is my financial life, or this is my pieced together bank.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what you're talking about is, I think the coolest part about the space we work in is that I think our customers and the underserved are extremely smart, right? And extremely capable. And in that sense, they're already doing it. It's somehow using technology to mimic, how are they mentally already bucketing? And then, can we just make that process almost easier for them?
And Bobby, I really liked you, not to give away too much, but you've talked about ideas in financial inclusion that must die. And one of them is right along the lines of this conversation, which is financial inclusion has a single purpose. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on that, because it is true. I think we've all realized that financial inclusion for financial inclusion's sake, one, may not be the goal we should be orienting ourselves around, but also isn't selling very well these days. So I wondered if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, my answer to that is sometimes I feel like the argument is slightly academic, because a lot of these conversations end up in the space of, well, how are we going to measure the impact of what we're trying to achieve? And I think, depending on the organization that we work for, we can all come at this from a very different perspective. And I think all of them are fine. I mean, I think, when I looked at the question about, financial sustainability, I can equally say I do believe that that's just as important as some of these others, because you can't have the benefits of financial services without knowing that those services are going to be around for people, because I think there are too many examples of where really great ideas, real needs need to be met. For example, through insurance, they fail because of the private, or whether they're private or public partnerships or not, but different types of partnerships between actors fail, or they couldn't get enough uptake because there were challenges. So part of me says it's everything that Eric posed in his blog piece, and I think it just depends on at what angle you're coming at the question from. And I think they all have value, because even when I think of putting theories of change together for the development, quite it's more for development or more for equity, the impact that you're aiming to achieve is at a very different level. But part of that chain of events is the fact that you need to get people to use the services, and if you can't get them to access them, they're not available and they can't use them, then it doesn't really matter what else you were aiming to achieve. Like, that's the first starting point for creating some, believing that you're creating benefit beyond that. So I think part of it is just to say, let's accept it's all of it, and all of it actually matters. And we just need to, it makes it complex in that sense, because you feel like you're having to pay attention to all of those pieces. But I actually do think that's the job that we're asked to do, is to pay attention to all of those pieces. The sustainability of it, people have equitable access, there are development objectives from it, and that The research is there that just, having a bank account, having access to mobile money can really impact people's lives.
If I were to press you to take a position on why financial inclusion matters and what you're aiming for when you get up in the morning and do this work, what would you guys say? Is it similar to Bobby, like it all matters and our job is to make these products and services useful and viable and affordable for people? Or is there one that stands out to you more?
So my take, when I looked at the different answers to the question that Eric put forward, I thought, it depends on where you are and who you are, is how you're going to answer this question. Because I think in a developing country or a least developed country where only, 20% of the people are connected in any formal way to finance, you'll probably answer this question differently. Just having basic access is necessary for so many things that focusing on that basic access maybe that has to be the primary goal as we approach it from a development perspective. Then you get to the question of tactics. Well, then how do we get to that? And that's where I think we have to be a bit more flexible in terms of how we get there. And what I mean by that is we for a while we're like, oh, the access to finance is credit, and that's what draws people in. And then we said, well, no, actually the first access point to finance is that people just want to put aside money, so it's savings. And then it all became about payments. That's the on-ramp to financial inclusion, and now it's payments. But what we're seeing in a lot of countries now is it's not really that. It could be a ride-hailing service. That's your access to finance. It could be that you want to buy something through, Facebook Marketplace. That could be, or you want to sell something through Facebook Marketplace. So that could be the reason why you get on the on-ramp. So I think in some ways we almost have to distinguish between what are we trying to achieve, which could be very geographically or socioeconomically specific, but then what is the tactic that we're using? And then who are the actors who could actually support that tactic and make it work?
Great. Thank you for differentiating between the tactics and the objectives. That's a good point. Shivani, do you have a response to that?
I do. I mean, I think it's similar to what both Bobby and Till are saying. And we think about it internally as we think about it as this idea of financial agency. And so we think of it as, do you have the capacity and do you have the tools to actually be able to interact and control your financial life in a sense, so that you have choices and you have the control, like you are the agent in that financial life. And that'll always continue to change depending on the stage and context of your life, which is why I think, we internally really try to keep our North Star about increasing the financial health of customers. And so we think of it as, one, does the person have the ability to manage their day-to-day? Do they have that resilience, that ability to overcome from shocks? And then can they actually move to a place of planning and prioritizing new opportunities? That's something that we can use to understand in some ways like inclusion. And that's kind of why we don't use the word inclusion. Is
why don't you use the term financial inclusion and talk to us about why equity and financial agency are so important to you?
In some ways, we almost think that it can lead to a binary metric almost. You're either in the formal system or you're not. And really, when you think of someone's financial life, what you want to be thinking about is, given all the different contexts of people's life and the things that they may want to do, it's really about, can we enable people to be the agents of that financial life? And so to have the capacity, access to the tools that allow them to control and choose the decisions that they make in their financial life. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, how we think about it. And it revolves around this North Star for us around financial health as the thing that we want to increase. And so financial health for us is three things. And that's how we develop our roadmaps internally, is day-to-day management. So can you actually, again, meet the things you essentially need to do day to day? Can you be resilient to shocks, emergencies? And then that last piece is, do you have the ability to plan and prioritize new opportunities? And if we can move our customers or individuals through this spectrum, then we know that it's not really inclusion, but it's really we are actually creating an equitable environment for this person and giving them the tools that will allow them also to have that, it's like if you believe everyone has potential, then your goal is to actually create the equitable environment for them to actually achieve that full potential to whatever that may be for them.
I wonder, I'm thinking about my own life, and I don't think about having a financial life. And that's probably a luxury. But I wonder if it's true for most people. They don't think of their financial life as being something distinct or something that they even want to focus on. I think what people want is their financial life to be kind of invisible, that things work. And so I think it's I love the concepts around financial health. And I think the three of those actually, the 3 points you've listed, address what it means then to just have it work. So I just, anyway, I just want to raise, I'm not sure people actually think of having financial lives. It might be something that's very useful for us to think about as an industry so that we can break down what that means because we realize it is part of our life. But I just don't think it's something that people think about or want to think about.
Or they only think about it when their financial life is in a mess and
Exactly.
they realize they need to clean house to make, when you face that crisis, whether you become over indebted from a health shock or you lose your income and realize all of a sudden that financial life is actually there. And then all of a sudden it becomes very apparent how protected or how unprotected, you actually are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that we spend so much time, nowadays talking about preventative care and all of these different things to ensure we can have healthy lives. But it's this whole area that even the three of us don't really, I don't know how much we do to proactively care about our financial health.
Yeah, I think if we start thinking about it in terms of our financial lives, sometimes our own eyes start to glaze over because it ceases being interesting to us because it's not a core part of what we want to do day to day. That's why I think the breakdown of the financial health that you provided, which is, hey, can I do what I want to do day to day? Can I avoid serious emergencies or get out of them quickly? And can I just plan, make some basic plans for the future? All of those are, exactly what you described, but I don't think of those things in terms of finance, and I'm not sure a lot of people do. But I wondered if I'm just looking at some of the other goals that Eric put forward, and I think the other thing that struck me when I looked at them is that there are so many possible goals for financial inclusion to different actors. If you look at how fast things like m-commerce is growing in Asia, that makes financial inclusion a goal for a very, very large industry, hundreds of millions of dollar industry that's growing in Asia. And they can be part of this financial inclusion community. If you look at the clean energy sector, which is a multi-billion-dollar sector globally, they could be part of the financial inclusion community. If we think about government budgets and the amount of tax collections and payments that they're making every year and all the benefits of having their population financially included, they really can be part of this financial inclusion community. So I think in some ways, because it's become such a necessary underpinning, not just for development issues that we're trying to accomplish, but for economic growth in countries, I think that we have actually a really interesting opportunity right now, because basically everybody wants what we have to sell. We just have to sell them what they want, if you get what I'm saying, or the distinction. We have to show them how they can contribute to making this possible, because I think almost unlike in the past where people weren't necessarily convinced that this was something that they really needed to worry about, I think everyone now kind of agrees, yeah, having everyone connected, having everyone with an account, especially and a digital account where we can reach them and they can reach us, is an ideal outcome. So I think the question is, how do we harness this incredible interest, both for-profit interest and public interest, and getting this done, and being open to a whole bunch of goals that we may not share with others, but a lot of people have this goal for various different reasons.
What you're saying, it's almost like you need financial services. Every sector needs its own financial services. For example, if you're talking about ag, like instead of it feeling like, oh, we need cross-sectoral collaboration, you actually don't need cross-sectoral collaboration. Like you need integration of financial services within each of these other domains of our life. Is that kind of the point that you were raising, Till?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you look at, and it gets again to where's the best starting point. If the best starting point, for instance, as we're seeing in some countries, proves to be m-commerce, and that's why people are getting into wallets, then I guess or just some type of digital account, then the question is, how do we work with that and expand it and make that the on-ramp and make it more accessible so that other sectors can actually use that? So I think there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different actors with whom we can work who are already playing a role in different ways in terms of driving financial inclusion. And I think it's really just a question, again, of harnessing them, figuring out which ones we need to work with. How do we work with GrabPay, which is starting to expand in payments for all different types of services beyond just ride hailing, and get them into some of the other things that we're interested in? You know, that could be a great way to expand access, not just to finance, but to a range of different financial services for different purposes.
And do you think that the private sector, I mean, maybe this is the thing that I'm curious about is, how do we make it happen? And does it need to come from a centralized kind of third party that needs to kind of push for this? In that sense that, if we look at it, one of the biggest challenges in this space is, the lack of infrastructure. We don't have national IDs across all markets. We don't have aggregated payment systems. We don't have, an automated way to do digital KYCs. There's all these things. And so companies like Tala are having to take that entire supply chain and kind of tackle every single problem in it, as opposed to, if there was some sort of, I wonder, mandate or some sort of like, hey, if you're working in Indonesia, everyone's going to contribute some way to this initiative. Would it help all of us and the customer, or would that be worse for the customer in terms of like limiting choice? I don't know.
Well, what has your experience been so far, Shivani? I mean, and the fact that you're kind of having to do it all. I mean, do you have experiences that said, I mean, my sense is, at least from what I've seen, and I think about some of the work UNCDF has been doing to, really build out that ecosystem, but it's a long-term game. There's short-term successes that happen, but it seems to be that by the time certain major initiatives are done, it's just the tip of the iceberg of the efforts that went on that, will have to continue. So to me, I think my perspective is that it's definitely needed, and because I think people have to see how their needs are all connected and how everybody contributes to different types of needs. But I also just wonder, from your perspective, is the approach that you have, do you feel like that's a sustainable approach, or because you are having to do so much that if you had somebody else helping build the ecosystem, then you can focus more on what you originally set out to do?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's an interesting point because, there's the product delivery aspect. So, if it's starting in one point of that spectrum around, let's say, access to liquidity, doing that really well is already hard. And then, taking on these other pieces on top of that becomes more challenging. At the same time, I think the opportunity around taking on the other aspects of the infrastructure and the ecosystem are, if you do it the right way with positive intent around saying, you're building customer first, you're building so that, it furthers the ecosystem, then in some ways you build in such a way that it promotes furthering that ecosystem as opposed to it being self-serving. I think we'd have to all put guidelines around that to really say it has to be interoperable, it has to be these things, which I think a lot of times we've like stopped and started, right? Because every time it starts to be, if you have this public-private sector thing, how do you get to that balance? That's the difficulty.
Can I ask you all to come back to this question of our non-existent or our boring financial lives? The idea that we don't think of ourselves as having a financial life, we just have a life and we use money to make that life happen. Bobby and Till were talking about this earlier, how to make our financial lives more fun. And wouldn't it be nice if we got a star or a ping or something when we saved a few pennies or what have you? How do we do that? How do we make our financial lives more interesting? And do we need to, in order to get access and use and value communicated and resonating with our target customers?
It's a interesting question. And again, I think it depends on perhaps where somebody is in terms of their financial life. So I would say there are some people where they're in a stable financial life, where maybe the best thing for them is they just want their financial life to be invisible and reliable, and that's good enough. It doesn't need to be fun. I just want it to be invisible and reliable. But then there are other people whose financial lives are not in such a good situation. And so maybe what they want is they want to have their early warning systems in place so they know when they're treading into dangerous territory with their financial life. And then they want some incentives or motivation to try to correct that. And then I think, as you mentioned, maybe a little bonus or reward when they actually do, which continues to incentivize them to monitor and say, hey, now I can go back to ignoring my financial life. I'm back in good shape. But then I think you have others who are just have very, very basic, complicated, but very small scale financial lives. And I think there the question is, okay, well, how do you turn this into something that's very small scale that can be something that grows and provides more and more of the needs of that person or their family? And there you might have to have more intervention to try to make it fun. Or if not fun, have more intervention to try to show why these things are so useful. So I'm just throwing out the idea that I don't think it's a single answer. I don't know if I necessarily want my financial life to be fun. I just want it to be reliable and visible.
No roller coasters is what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy when
Lazy
everything
river.
works.
I mean, I think I'm going to answer this. I'm not going to answer your question in the way you probably think I'm going to, because I think a lot of what as much as I like the idea of thinking about how to make it fun, I also have been spending a lot of time about how I think we actually should complicate what we're doing a little bit more in terms of not thinking about people as individuals, but thinking about people in the midst of their families and their households. And so even though this is probably a much bigger topic than what we have time for here, one of the things I brought out in my blog was the point about, especially if we're thinking about equity or we're thinking about women's financial inclusion, for example, that I think by focusing on individuals, we've left out the important roles that other people play in making financial decisions and who has what service, and our households covered with certain financial services versus thinking it's just one individual that we're targeting. And I think some of this comes from coming to a greater recognition that we can actually, I can see now some of the effect of just targeting women with financial services. And on one hand, you think this is great. We're creating that visibility. There are more women with access to these services. But on the flip side of that, if they're the only ones in their household that have access, that also puts them, at risk. So I'm actually kind of hoping that the sector starts to come around and thinking about how do we build more of household financial capability so that individuals within a household can agree on what those financial goals and how they're going to achieve them. So it's not answering your question, but in a sense, it's kind of to say I'm answering it on the reverse of it being fun, kind of moving into a little bit more of an uncomfortable place that I don't think we've spent a lot of time working on.
No, thank you for that, Bobby. That is great. It's a question I wanted to ask you. And in fact, Till asked Bobby earlier that we tend to think of financial inclusion for women as its own thing. Bobby, tell us how well or not well that's serving us.
Well, I think I'll just share a quick experience that, we've had in a few different markets now where, we've been using savings group approaches, for example, and using those savings groups to link women to mobile wallet accounts, access to formal savings accounts at banks and things like that. And after several years of doing this work, and I think it kind of comes to the third point that I made in the blog piece about financial services is not always good, or people's access to them is not always good, that if we don't focus on what risks we're potentially creating, we don't actually see the full picture of the benefit that we're creating in people's lives. And one of in several places we've had this experience where now women, when we're talking to them about the use of the credit or the savings, that they're using within their household. We've all known for a long time that women will often give their credit to somebody else in their household, if it's their spouse, their son, etc. So the benefit that they're receiving from that may be limited, especially if that income is not used, for the full household, or she's not getting benefit from it. But what you see happening is that it does create some inter-household conflict when she's bringing the credit into the household, somebody else is using it. She has still that social responsibility to a group for the repayment, and men are feeling left out because there's been so much investment really trying to build women's financial inclusion, that men are being left out because they're in really rural communities, and either men don't necessarily want the responsibility, or they're just not even offered. And so basically you're offering services to women and disrupting some of those social norms as to how households are meant to access funds and things like that. So one of the observations we've had is that, the research is there that suggests women need access to financial services and that individualized service so that they can protect their funds. So there's all of that rigorous research out there that's kind of showing that consistently over time, but none of us have really done research about how do you think about building the capability of at least the spouses in a household to think about how do they have a common financial goal, because I think what you see are these conflicting inter-household goals where he may want to invest in the farm, she may want to keep her kids in school. The same pot of funds are tending to try to support both, but they don't have a cohesive agreement or a plan as to how they'll prioritize, those household finances. So I don't have an example, and I think the challenge is I don't have a perfect example of something that's working on that, except to raise it as a little bit of a red flag and a question mark. Like, are there examples out there where we have approached households and we've given them the same financial education, the same access to the services, and letting the household decide who in the household is best positioned to use a specific service on behalf of the household? I don't know how many examples of those are out there, but it's definitely a question in an area I'd love to see more research and a lot more work in, just so that we can decide, do we need to shift our gears to in thinking more about providing services to a household? Now, I will say the caveat in all of that is that if you also look at this from a gender-based violence perspective, not all women may want to intermingle and have these financial decisions. They may not desire something that creates more visibility of their own financial behaviors, but I do think it's something that we have to figure out, so that in those places where you do have couples that are in agreement that they need to work together towards a common goal, that we give them the tools to do that.
Thanks, Bobby. Till, you also wrote a blog for Financial Inclusion Week 2019. And in your piece, you suggest 6 ways for making digital financial services more useful. Can you tell us what those are, and why do you think it's been such a challenge to get providers to include these in product design?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It actually wasn't about I guess I did say 6 ideas to make it useful. That's the title, but maybe that's a misnomer. It was maybe 6 ideas to making a financially included world, because number 1 is to make it useful. The number 1 thing I wrote is make it useful, which means it has to do one of 2 things. The savings or the efficiencies or the ease of it has to be so great to the client that they're willing to leave something that they're very comfortable with, to which they've got a physical attachment, cash, and actually move into the digital world. Or it has to solve a real problem that they have or provide a real opportunity that they want to take advantage of. And if it doesn't do that, people there are very good reasons for them not to get financially included or get a digital account. The second one I mentioned is make it fun. And we talked about some active ways to make financial services fun. But what I wanted to point out in the blog is, as The Economist noted, with 50% of the world coming onto the internet, that as new people come onto the internet, what they're doing mostly with it is chatting with friends and family and, watching videos. And the point is that they're using it for social things. And so we need to recognize that people are getting connected, not necessarily to do these great development things that we think. They're actually getting connected to entertain themselves or to find ways to make their lives more enjoyable. So it's also thinking, well, how do we attach financial inclusion to things that it's not just about what people need, but what they want to do? making it lucrative, I point out, because if you look at how financial inclusion is growing, and with through m-commerce, particularly in Asia, but it's starting now to pick up in other regions. We don't think of that as being financial inclusion, but if someone ends up getting a digital account so they can go buy stuff on Alibaba, well, that kind of is financial inclusion. So we need to think about all these companies that are benefiting from people having wallets that drives their main business, because that can really help, I think, drive financial inclusion. Which gets me to a fourth point, which seems contradictory, but is actually not. It's linked, and that's make it free. And that is a lot of these big players that are getting into wallets because it's feeding their main business, like commerce or ride hailing or solar. They're actually making the basic wallet and the payment free because it feeds the rest of the business. And I think we just have to accept that not everyone in the world, we're not going to be able to financially include everyone in the world, that there's going to be a cost attached to it. We need to figure out a freemium model to really reach the remaining 1.7 billion. And then the last but not least is we just need to make it easier. We addressed this a little bit. We talked about, well, what's the right public-private partnership to start building out the rails for a digital financial ecosystem? And I don't think there's a single answer. We have example in India where the government is playing a pivotal role, but then they stop at a certain point and they want people to pile on in terms of their ID real-time payments and basic accounts platform that they've created. And then you see other countries like China, where basically a few companies are single-handedly now driving the finance space, and it's because of e-commerce, and that's how it's being done. So I don't think there's a single answer. We're seeing it how it plays out. But I do think it makes a difference is that if we approach it with the intent and saying, great, we want to create a completely connected, a digitally financed connected country, then we need to have the intent and we need to engage with all the actors that have an interest in doing that.
Shivani, as a DFS provider, would you add anything else to that list?
No, I mean, I think we've all touched on it in different ways. I think there's definitely the intent. I think we're all saying that there is a role that every stakeholder plays in making a financial system really work and be equitable. So everyone from the regulators to, the governments to the private sector, public sector, the customers, everyone's got to be a part in it. And we have to really, again, start from a place of understanding everyone's needs. I think to the fun aspect, I think what we're saying is really how do you integrate it? And so fun is just one aspect of that integration point. But I think overall, I think the theme that I think I would come away with is we're all talking about trust ultimately, right? It's all the stakeholders have to trust each other through this, and we have to find mechanisms and contracts for that. And then ultimately, it's getting our customers and the individuals themselves trusting themselves and their ability to actually, take control. And then hopefully, vice versa, they trust us to provide those services to them.
Thank you all. Can I ask one last question to set us on our way? I think we've established that this is an important question to ask, and you all have answered it by asking a lot of other important questions, posing a lot of other important questions. What do you think our question or our theme for next year should be? What's the burning question that leaves you from this conversation?
A question that I find myself asking a lot these days is, what is financial inclusion? And I say that because I think, we talk about pay-as-you-go solar now as financial inclusion, but 10 years ago, that certainly wasn't on the radar screen as being anything remotely related to financial inclusion. I think our definition of financial inclusion has been expanding, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. But I think that it would be good for us to maybe sit down and say, well, what are we actually talking about again? And where is the development role in all of this? Yeah, I do think that just based on how the private sector has entered the market in such a big way, particularly around payments, I think we do need to maybe take a pause and figure out exactly, all right, what is it we're trying to accomplish? And what do we define as financial inclusion going forward?
Great, thank you.
And I would say my answer is probably reflected on a little bit of my point earlier. Like, I would love to have a conversation about what is our role in changing inter-household dynamics and how households look at their finances versus, the approach that we've taken about individual financial inclusion. So I'd love that to be a conversation for next year.
Thanks, Bobby.
I would love to, I think I would love to broaden the aspect of inclusion. And so we've touched on this aspect of equity. We've touched on aspects around the emotional aspects of money. And so how do we redefine what does an equitable financial system really look like?
Thanks, Shivani. Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I'm really happy to have the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shivani and Till. It was great meeting
Bobby,
both of you.
Shivani, great to meet you both virtually.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Once again, I'd like to thank Bobby Gray, Till Bruit, and Shivani Thoreau for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Tess Johnson, Neil Kennedy, and Eric Nagel from the Center for Financial Inclusion for their help in the production of today's podcast. For more information about Financial Inclusion Week, please visit our website, centerforfinancialinclusion.org, and follow the global conversation using our hashtag FinClusionWeek. All the information about partners and events and blogs are available online. Thanks for listening.